we very much feel we live in a world of paradoxes, a world of sometimes aligned, sometimes misaligned voices, a world that in many areas is fueling a sense of optimism and opportunity, including many investment opportunities, but also a world that fuels an increased sense of uncertainty and volatility. After all, we've just had a new Gulf War unleashed over the weekend. We're talking about geopolitics, the rapid shaping of a new world order around us. We can certainly feel it. We are at a moment of juncture. Mark Carney recently in Davos spoke about a moment of rupture. We are witnessing a post-1945 world order that is rapidly fading away, the emergence of new large blocs, this growing rivalry between the US and China.
Why do we still want to be invested in this context? I think there are two key reasons. The first reason is, however I look at the world today, taking into account all the growth constraints, all the risks, I also look at the offsets, and I find to view that this global economy is bound to continue to expand. We're still in an economic expansion. And in an economic expansion, companies make money, people have jobs, and people spend. Right? And that is a very important reason that keeps us in the market. The second reason for which we're sticking to our positions today is when you think about market corrections, not volatility. Volatility, we're going through it now. Hopefully, we'll take advantage of it. We had some volatility episodes last year, the year before. There's always a bit of volatility every year. But thinking about big market corrections that last months, if not quarters, it's always preceded by something very important, which is usually an increase in interest rates. An increase in interest rates is like going up the mountains. The higher you go, the less oxygen you have in the air, and the more difficult it is for economic and financial agents, especially those who have a leveraged balance sheet. Today, we're not in an environment where interest rates are increasing. Central banks have been cutting rates. So putting the two together, we're still in an economic expansion. We see central banks cutting rates rather than raising rates. And that's a fundamental reason for us to stay in the markets. What's very important when we do our risk analysis is always to try to understand if these risks remain contained or if they become dominant. Dominant in a way that they can harm the economic expansion or that they can change the interest rate outlook for the worst. One of the first risks that I think about is labor markets. I don't like to see people losing their jobs, going for unemployment benefits, cutting down spending, because this leads to the end of the economic expansion. But the conclusion is, I have no red flags. When I look at labor markets in Asia, in Europe, in the UK, in Switzerland, and in the US, I see no recession around the corner. And of course, the topic of the day, geopolitics, right? Will geopolitics and the crisis that we're going through in the Middle East roll over my expansion, lead to higher interest rates, and kill this market cycle? You know as well as I do, everything is dependent on the duration of the conflict and on what it means for energy markets. Our key working assumption here is that this is a question of weeks, not a question of months or quarters. What is key to this conflict is the Strait of Hormuz. This is where you have 20% of oil flows that go through, not only oil, gas, fertilizer, absolutely central to the global economy. So my expansion cannot support a closure or a disruption of Hormuz that would last months or quarters. Now, one of the reasons it might only last weeks is also the fact that out of the 20 million of barrels a day that go through Hormuz, 40% of that goes to China. So the first victim of a disruption in Hormuz is the Iranians themselves, because this is where they get their source of revenue. But it's also China, because they get a lot of energy from there. One thing to keep in mind is that we're not short of supply. Right? You see on the right-hand side chart of the page, the Americans, the Saudis are willing to use strategic reserve, deploy more supply to make sure that the oil price remains contained. So this is the consequence of a $10 oil shock, which is basically what we're going through now, period of 6 months. Oil prices are $10 higher than where they should be. The economic impact of that is actually pretty benign. On inflation, you will have to add 0.5%. So inflation in the US is currently 2.5, 2.6. You need to add 0.5 for a period of 6 months. That leads US inflation to hover around 3%. 3%. The impact on growth is mainly seen through industrial production, manufacturing activity. You strip that out a bit. The service sector compensates somewhat. Basically, the impact on growth is 0.1, 0.2%. US growth is growing at 2.2, so you strip out 0.1, 0.2, you find yourself with US growth at 2%. And then the impact on the unemployment rate is 0.15. The unemployment rate currently in the US is 4.3, so the unemployment rate would rise to 4.4, 4.5. This is pretty benign, right? So again, if we have that kind of scenario, $10 higher over a period of 6 months, not enough to break the back of my expansion. In an expansion, again, you get no recession in Asia, no recession in Europe, no recession in the US. Companies continue to make money, people continue to have jobs. We want to stay in the markets. Before the turmoil in the Middle East, there was this narrative about the dollar is collapsing, the world is de-dollarizing. I want to contest that view, and I want to contest that fear that the US will no longer be financed by global markets. What is missing in the discussion about the dollar that is so-called falling is the starting point, which is that post-COVID, the dollar was 2 standard deviation expensive. We're just out of a period of a very, very strong dollar versus the pound sterling. The dollar was at 120. This is not natural for the pound to be at 120. The euro was close to parity. Dollar yen was at 160. Dollar yuan was 7.2. I mean, these currencies cannot be so cheap versus the dollar for eternity. At some point, they need to normalize. So we're not seeing a dollar collapse. We're not even seeing a dollar weakening. We're simply seeing a normalization of the dollar from extremely expensive level to more normal levels. When you think about how the world is organized, we live in a world of producers. Who absorbs that production? It's this guy here, the blue one, the American consumer, which is the main source of demand out there. One American consumer by itself consumes more than a European, a Chinese, and an Indian combined. Right? So we all want a share of the US consumer, and goods will continue to flow, and flows will continue to flow, financial flows, rest of the world into the US. There's another reason why flows continue to go from rest of the world into the US, and that's the dark line that you see here. This dark line is corporate profits. We all want to be invested in good US companies that make a lot of profits. We like to be invested in the Nvidias, Google, Apple of this world, right? And so again, that secures some form of financing and balance. Eventually, you could tell me, yes, but this dark line here, this is mostly tech. This is mostly tech profits. Absolutely. So if ever we're in a bubble in tech, potentially investors will no longer want to be invested in US tech. They will shy away the US, and the US will lose a source of financing. So we're not in the camp that there's a bubble in AI. I actually think we're at the beginning of this story, and there is still a lot of wind in the sails. Let me first cover the idea of the bubble. We need to compare the situation that we're in today, which is right-hand side chart, to the bubble days, late 90s, early 2000, which is left-hand side chart. If you see, at the late 90s, we were in an environment where prices went through the roof, but profits didn't follow. So you had this disconnect between prices and profits. That's called the bubble, right? If you look at today, there is no disconnect between prices and profits because profits followed. So this is a very fundamental driven price increase, right? Profits are doing relatively well. How can these American companies continue to generate so much profits quarter after quarter in technology? My simple answer is competition. We're in this strategic competition between China and the US, and the platform is technology. Competition leads to capex, capex leads to demand, demand leads to profits. Right? So as long as we're in this strategic competition between China and the US, we're going to continue to see capex, we're going to continue to see demand, we're going to continue to see profits.
In my view, the crucial aspects of the tech race between the US and China is that China has already overtaken the US to dominate global technology in all but a few specific technology areas. And Europe, I'm afraid, it has been left far behind, apart from in a tiny few technologies. I think there's a risk now that we fail to appreciate how quickly China is accelerating into the future. And just to reinforce this point, I'd like to give a few pieces of evidence. China is ahead in 66 out of 74 crucial technologies. The US is ahead in only 8. Similarly, if we look at the World Intellectual Property Office at the United Nations, we find that the number of patents filed for approval by Chinese companies now stands at 1.8 million, whereas US is just 500,000. The number of STEM graduates from Chinese universities last year was 6 million. That's more than all of the G7 countries put together. And crucially, China has fairly robust economic growth. So its tech companies have a market that they can readily sell into. And this year, China will contribute probably about 26% of global GDP growth. Again, more than the G7 countries combined. Noah Zirkin comes from New York, actually, but he was previously working in Silicon Valley. Noah's story is really instructive of what lies behind China's tech rise. His reason for moving to Shenzhen from Silicon Valley was, as he put it, the unassailable superiority of the Chinese supply chain. He basically said that the reason he's there in the Pearl River Delta in Shenzhen is that you can source any component you need, literally anything, within a single day of his office. And he said, you can literally get the parts to build a spaceship, all within a single day. To me, this represents the greatest single point of technological and, I would argue, geopolitical power in the world today. China's supply chain makes everything, and it does so cheaper, quicker, and often better than anywhere else in the world. And here I want to address two areas. One is semiconductors, and the other is artificial intelligence. We all know that China is behind the US when it comes to semiconductors. NVIDIA is far out ahead, but China has got a strategy to go around this, to circumvent this problem. It's called the supercluster strategy. And it basically means just clustering a whole load of semiconductors onto a node, and then using the combined performance of all of those chips clustered onto a node to create a better outcome than you would simply chip for chip. One of the first of these was called Cloud Matrix 384, and it just had 384 Ascend, Huawei Ascend 910C chips on it. And it was able to outperform a similar NVIDIA rack by 2 times in terms of compute performance. Now Huawei is forging ahead. Its latest supercluster combines not 384 chips, but 15,000. And by the end of this year, there will be a supercluster done by Huawei with 500,000 chips, and next year it'll be over 1 million. In my view, this will allow China to bridge the AI capability gap with the US. The truth is that when it comes to AI, which is being generally described as the most important technological race that we have in the world now and perhaps in history, China has several structural advantages. The power costs in China are much lower. The talent, as I already mentioned, is much more numerous and much cheaper. And the cost of training China's large language models is currently about 10 times or even 30 times less than in the US. The Chinese government has a plan that by 2030, 90% of the economy will be penetrated by AI apps that will help to animate different economic sectors. This, I think, will leave everybody else in the dust. This rather unassuming slide is actually the tale of an earthquake to come. Because if you look at the right-hand circle, the 2030 projection, you'll see that China is predicted to take 49% of the world's industrial production by 2030. That's up from just 6% that China performed in the year 2000. So that's an 8-fold increase. By comparison, in 2030, the US will have 11%. That's down from 25% in the year 2000. And the other Western countries are similarly squeezed by China's rise. This slide shows a new car. It's called the YU7. It's launched by Xiaomi, which previously was a mobile phone company, but is now forging ahead into making cars. The Xiaomi YU7 is made in a dark factory in Beijing. It operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is near 100% automation in this factory, not a single human being on the production line. And a new YU7 is produced every 76 seconds. How can we in Europe compete with that? But I suggest there might be something to at least think about. It seems to me a lot of Europe's problems come down to overregulation, inefficiency, labor rights, and other social issues. But if there's hardly anyone working in these factories, then surely this is a capital problem. If we invest, surely we can build the capacities that we need. And then maybe in a joint venture with China, maybe we use our own technology, but maybe we have a chance, maybe automation, the robots, gives us a chance to develop in a different way from in the past.
I think the Americans are very right to be fearful and insecure about the dominance that China has on a certain number of sectors. China is very strong in industrial output, production, typically. China totally dominates rare earth, refining close to 90% of rare earths, and China dominates the production and the generation of electricity, which is required for tech. The reverse is actually very true as well. The Chinese are right to feel insecure about the US because the US does dominate on totally other fronts. The US dominates in terms of compute power, right? NVIDIA is able to produce chips that Huawei or other Chinese firms are very, very, very far to match. The US still dominate in terms of space, and the US dominate traditional energy. How long did the Cold War lasted in this strategic competition between the Soviets and the Americans? Maybe 30 years. How long has it been since the Chinese and the Americans are engaged into that strategic competition centered around tech? Maybe 8 years. So I do think that in 10 and 20 years, we'll still be discussing about this confrontation between China and the US. It's not great. It does create conflict, but the offset is that it generates a lot of capex. We're in an investment boom centered around technology, and that is an important offset. Tariffs are here to stay, and let's be fair, they are bad for my expansion scenario. I don't like that. But what I'm saying is that despite this growth constraint, we have significant offsets. The other significant offsets is that governments are supporting the system as well. There is positive fiscal impulse absolutely everywhere. There's the OBBA, so Trump's budget, you can like it or dislike it, but it is tax cuts, it is public investment, it is public spending, it is supporting the US economy. The Chinese are doing exactly the same. And to be fair, in Europe, we're actually having a lot of fiscal impulse, mainly from this side, which is Germany and its new budget centered around defense. The Germans changed their constitution to be able to spend more money in their economy. That is a strong offset that keeps Europe, in my view, into expansion. So let me conclude here. Despite the turmoil in the Middle East, we continue to be invested. I think the key element here is that we've been stress testing a lot of risks. They remain contained in our view. There are a lot of growth offsets. The private sector is in good shape. There's a lot of capex investment around tech. Central banks are cutting rates. Governments are supporting the economy. That leads to continued expansion. We want to stay in the markets. Reasonable level of risk, but today no reason to cut significantly that level of risk.